What's going on, everybody? I am TST's the Mudman, and it is time to figure out what deck we are going to play for this upcoming Gods Unchained weekend ranked event. So let's start off the same way we always do. We're on gudex.com. We are looking at God popularity and mythic rank over the past 7 days. And a huge surprise, Nature is on top, War is second. Just like we talked about last week, War is encroaching on Nature's top slot. Nature is at 29.1%, War is at 27.6%, so they're basically tied at number one. So this weekend, definitely expect to see lots of Nature and War as per usual. Then we've got Magic, Death, and Deception, which are all floating around 12 to 10%, and then Light at the bottom at 8% of the meta. So let's just go over generally what each god is going to do. What decks can you expect to see when you encounter each god? So Nature, our most popular god, that is generally mid-range Nature, leaning towards aggression. War can be aggressive Slayer War. However, the current best archetype in the meta right now is mid-range Control War using Valka's Presence. That deck is incredibly powerful. You'll definitely see both archetypes, aggressive War as well as mid-range Control. Both are incredibly powerful. Magic is generally tempo spell magic. Death is usually zombies, but it could also be board wipe death. Board wipe death is probably the second or third best archetype in the meta right now. However, you need a very large collection in order to create board wipe death, so it's not particularly prevalent on the ladder. Deception can be anything. It can be hidden rush deception for aggro. It can be mid-range guild. It can be mid-range control. It can be full-blown sleep control deception. Deception can be a little bit of anything. You're definitely going to want to look up your opponent when you play against a Deception player. And then Light is always Zoolight, but Light is pretty much irrelevant because it's only 8% of the meta. You'll probably run into like between 1 and 0 Light decks over the weekend. Yeah, but that is about it. Before we start looking at the decks, I'd like to just make a quick announcement. This YouTube channel, the TST YouTube channel, is extremely close to 1,000 subscribers. If you don't know, once a channel hits 1,000 subscribers, that's when YouTube starts treating you like a real boy. And you're definitely going to want to be subscribed because when we hit that 1,000 subscriber milestone, we're going to do a big, huge YouTube giveaway. So you're going to want to be notified for that video. And if you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button and get us to that 1,000 sub goal, and you won't be disappointed. So without further ado, let's jump into the deck that won last week's weekend ranked event. Alright, so the first archetype we're going to talk about is Mid-Range Control War. This is the list that won last week's weekend ranked event with a perfect score of 25-0. This list was made by Caution Fun, and just like what we've been saying for the past couple of weeks, this is the best archetype in the game, and it's because it's just incredibly strong all throughout the game. If you go over here and we look at the curve, you can see there are, 18 cards that cost less than 5 mana. So if you're playing against aggressive decks like Light or mid-range aggressive Nature, you have tons of early game stuff that can totally compete with whatever early game they throw at you, right? Your Pyramid Wardens and your Master Tacticians and your Tavern Brawlers, they compete with, Finian Fruit Bears and Black Jaguars or what have you. And then as you get to like the mid game, obviously Adi is super powerful, turning your demos and your Hectors into 6-mana creatures, as well as just, a nice strong protected creature for good trades. Archangel Bruiser controls the board exceptionally well. Its overkill is great for dealing with lots of creatures. Grand Hall is one of the stronger cards in this deck. It facilitates you being great at everything. So if you are in a position where you are ahead on the board, you're playing against a control deck and you've been plopping down stats, going face, getting lots of tempo in, Grand Hall can just be a creature buff. It comes down, it protects your Master Tacticians, your recently buffed Leviathan Hunters. They have to deal with that frontline creature before they deal with your other stuff, and it buffs all their attacks. You're dealing that much more damage. But when you're in positions where you are behind, let's say you're playing against something like Light or aggressive Nature, and they've taken the board, they've been beating you. Grand Hall is a big frontline creature that will heal you, so it'll help sustain you to get you to your demos and your Hectors. And it's also going to help you trade. Your existing creatures become stronger so they can take better trades than they could before, and you heal all in the process so you can get to those late game turns, which this deck is really great at performing in the late game. Then we have some of like the real heavy hitting removal, like the Karn sweeps. You can see we got Magic Missile Launcher here at the 4 mana slot. This is another great, board control tool. It's a relic with Blitz, so you play it, you destroy a creature, and then the next turn you can play Karn Sweep and just remove absolutely everything while healing off of the afterlife effect of the Magic Missile Launcher. So that's super, super powerful, and you can't talk about Karn Sweep without mentioning Leviathan Hunter. Leviathan Hunter is primarily in this deck for the Karn Sweep. It is a 1-mana creature that creates a relic, so with 5 mana and a pip, you can play Leviathan Hunter and Karn Sweep to completely clear your opponent's board. Also, it's just a decent card, in combination with something like Out of Its Misery. However, since your God Power is Valka's Presence, Out of Its Misery is literally never a dead card. Orcish Elite, don't need to talk about that for very long. Card's insane. 5 mana, kills one big thing or two mid-sized things. Card's super strong. Now we are entering the 6+ mana area of the deck. We've got Anus, who, similar to Orcish Elite, is just great at taking lots of 2-for-1s. He's great at destroying 2 creatures a turn and not dying. He's also really, really great to hit with the Soul Survive, since he's got, Everlasting Protected. Buffing his attack is really, really great. We've got Herdicus. We talk about Herdicus all the time. Extremely high tempo card. He buffs himself every single turn he's in your hand. And then when you eventually play him, you'll have a very strong high attack creature, and you'll destroy one of your opponent's creatures. So just huge tempo swing turn when you play Herdicus. Soul Survivor is arguably the best card in this deck. It turns any one of your creatures into a super threat as well as a mega AoE board clear. You guys don't need explanation for why Soul Survivor is so good. Soul Survivor is crazy strong. Now we've got Hector. Hector is another card. Hector would probably like to argue against Soul Survivor being the best card in the deck, because Hector is also in contention for best card. He's got every single keyword. He's got Twin Strike, Blitz, Protected, Leech. So you're going to play him, you're going to destroy 2 of your opponent's creatures, you're still going to have a creature on the board, and you're going to heal for like 12. It is incredibly powerful. And now we are on to the copy of Strength in Numbers. This is an interesting inclusion for this deck. If you remember from last week, we talked about Strength in Numbers as a great budget alternative for Jason, because Jason was incredibly popular in this archetype. However, Caution Fun does own a Jason, but he has opted for Strength in Numbers. He thinks Strength in Numbers is just strictly better than Jason, and I had the opportunity to talk to Caution about this, in detail. And so Jason has a higher ceiling, of course. You might play Jason and then get an Avatar, War, a Poly, and a Dionysus. Who knows? So his ceiling is nuts. But when you play Jason, if you play him in the early game, like if you play him on curve, all he really does is dilute your deck with a bunch of cards you don't want to draw yet. And then in the late game, you play him, you fill your deck with good stuff, but you don't have that good stuff yet. You still have to wait. So the only real advantage Jason has over Strength in Numbers is that Jason is a creature, so you can Soul Survivor him. Whereas Strength in Numbers is a spell, so you can't Soul Survivor Strength in Numbers. That being said, Strength in Numbers adds 4 random war creatures to your hand. It gives them all +2/+2. So all those creatures that it generates for you are excellent Soul Survivor targets, considering they've already been buffed. And the biggest difference between Strength in Numbers and Jason is Strength in Numbers puts all that stuff in your hand. So you have instant access to it. You can play it all the turn after. And it's not like Strength in Numbers is unable to high roll. You can play Strength in Numbers, and it can give you a Hector, a Herdicus, a Tavern Brawler, all buff +2/+2. There's a lot of great war cards that you can get. Strength in Numbers is definitely really strong, and another benefit is, like I said with Jason, you don't really want to play him in the early game. Jason's mana cost is kind of a lie. You can technically play him on turn 3, but he's actively bad on turn 3. You can't screw around and accidentally play Strength in Numbers too early. So, that's a fun aspect. Now let's jump into the neutral cards. We talked about Leviathan Hunter. This is just a combination card with Karn Sweep, generally speaking. Iron-Tooth Goblin is great in the mirror. It's also really, really great against Board-Wide Death, which is another one of the stronger archetypes. Both Death decks have infinite value relics. Zombies have Necroceptor, and Board-Wide Death has Khopesh. And you really, really want to get rid of cards like Khopesh if you are mid-range Control War, because it's going to be really hard to control your opponent's resources if they have some sort of relic that gives them infinite resources. Like this deck might be strong, but it can't kill infinite Packer's monsters. So you're going to need your Iron Tooths in there to get rid of relics like that. It's also really good against something like Palace's Wand. In a similar vein to Khopesh, if your magic opponent is drawing cards every single turn, it's going to be hard to control their resources. So Iron Tooth Goblin is super strong. Pyramid Warden, he's obvious, and Demogorgon is also obvious. This card stalls your opponent, heals you for a ton, make sure you don't die. You don't need explanation for why Demo is good. This is a super strong archetype. Definitely the best one out right now. If you have the cards to create mid-range control war, it will definitely win you a lot of games. Alright, and now let's move on to Death. This is a controlled Death deck made by Jack High, and this is a very interesting take on controlled Death. It does a lot of the standard board wipe Death stuff that, we're all very familiar with. You've got the Sirens of the Graves, as well as your Canopic Hoarders in order to get even more sleep. The heavy hitter at the end game is Neferu's Khopesh plus Packer's Monster. However, you may notice there are a bunch of strange cards in this deck. This deck runs all 3 of the Divine Order Death Legendaries. Obviously, there's Ava. We're all very familiar with Ava. She single-handedly beats any aggressive deck, turning all of their strong creatures into zombies. But there is also the Triage Necromancer. This card was buffed like a month or 2 ago, and this card is absolutely crazy. 5 mana, 5/5. At the end of your turn, summon a random 1-mana creature from your void. Let's look at our 1-mana creatures real quick. We will either be getting a Siren of the Graves, which is obviously completely broken. This is like the main sustain tool of your entire deck, getting permanent sleep. So your Triage Necromancer is essentially an avatar of nature that instead of making walking plants, makes Sirens of the Graves, which is absolutely bonkers. Your other 1-mana creature is Backstreet Bouncer, which this guy does not see a ton of play. He did, in God's Unchained past, but it's been a long time since Backstreet Bouncer has been in the meta. This is a 1-mana 1/1 with Afterlife, add a random rune to your hand. It may seem a little out of place. It's definitely good to get, these rune generators back every single turn from your Necromancer. That's super decent. As a control deck, all the runes are generally pretty good. Obviously, Runes of Fire and Runes of Strength, we've all seen those in the Sanctum. They're super strong. Rune of Healing is easily the weakest rune, and since you're a defensive deck, healing up a creature and sustaining your life total is not particularly bad. And then Rune of Sight is, decent for drawing cards. But one thing that you may not be thinking when you're looking at the Backstreet Bouncer is the rune that he generates is really, really convenient for discarding off of the Siren of the Graves. So your Backstreet Bouncer, helps facilitate your Siren, who, like we said before, is one of your strongest cards, and it makes it so his downside of obliterating a card in your hand can be mitigated by Backstreet Bouncer's rune. A similar thing can be said with the Sacred Lore, which is another card that sees almost no play. 3-mana spell that deals 1 damage to your god and gives you 3 random runes. Like I said before, as a control deck, the runes are generally pretty good. Generating more resources is always nice when you are trying to play resource, battles with your opponent. And, if you get a whole bunch of healing runes or Runes of Sight, you can discard them with your Siren of the Graves. Let's see, another interesting legendary card in this deck is Taket the Forgotten, the 3rd and final Divine Order Death Legendary. This card is also super strong in this deck. It's a 7-mana 2/5, so its stats are absolutely abysmal for its mana cost. It has backline, and at the start of your turn and Roar, you summon the strongest creature from your void and put it onto the board. You give it Soulless, and if it's an Anubian, you also give it Blitz and Leech. So let's just take a quick look at the Anubians that we have in this deck. So first off is the Triage Necromancer that I just gushed about for a long time. This card is super nuts, and you can bring him back with Leech with your Taket the Forgotten. Another great Anubian is Deathwatch Curate. Deathwatch Curate is a 5-mana 5/6, so his stats are very good for his mana cost, and if you're below 15 health, he heals you up for 3, so he's super strong. And then also remember, when he's brought back from Taket the Forgotten, it'll have Leech and Blitz. So if you are really low on health, like let's say, your opponent got you down to like 2 or 3, you play the Deathwatch Curate, you blitz him into something, you heal for 5, you end your turn, he heals you for another 3. It's really, really powerful. And then from there, we do normal board wipe death stuff. We've got 2 Apocalypse Nows in here to destroy literally any board ever. End Times for some more big board wipes as well as creature development. we talked about the Hippocrates Monster plus Khopesh combo. It's super strong. There is not a control deck in the game that can beat infinite Hippocrates monsters. So, that's a great inevitable win condition. In the neutral card slot, we discussed the Backstreet Bouncer already, and there's also 2 copies of the Trial Begins. Trial Begins is it's not the most common card in control death decks, but it's definitely seen play. However, 2 copies is definitely rare, especially considering there is no Neferu in this deck. Like 99% of the time, Trial Begins is searching for Neferu. In this deck, we're generally searching for either Siren of the Graves or one of those aforementioned Divine Order legendaries, whether it be the Triage Necromancer, the Taket the Forgotten, or the Ava. All 3 of those are amazing, but most of the time you're looking for the Siren of the Grave so you can start getting that sleep going. Let's see, everything else is fairly standard. You've got lots of healing with your Just the Nibbles, as well as your Fleshbind. You got your Fanatic. You're always looking for him in the mulligan so you can ramp up to your late game where you are extra explosive. And, one thing that you may have noticed, this is a controlled death deck. A controlled death deck that uses sleep mechanics. And there is not a single demo in the neutral slots, which is super cool. And I played a ton of games with this deck, and although demo is inarguably one of the best cards in all of Gods Unchained, you don't really miss it in this deck. You have lots and lots of sleep, naturally with your Signs of the Graves, your Canopic Hoarders, and then your Infinite Sirens with your Triage Necromancer. And healing is incredibly easy. We talked about just the Nibbles, the Fleshbinds, and then, like we said with the Taket the Forgotten, it's going to bring back some big creatures and give them leech, so your health total is rarely an issue. And this deck is a really cool take on control death or board wipe death. If you're someone like me and you've never been a huge fan of this archetype, this deck is really different, and this was actually like a really fun time. And on top of that, I talked about how the deck is cool, but the win rate is also really good. The creator, Jack High, he got 23 out of 25 wins last week. 36 games played by him with an 88% win rate, 94 games for the world at large with an 80% win rate. So the deck can definitely perform well on at the highest tiers. And this should be a really cool controlled death deck to play if you've got the cards for it. Alright, so now let's move on to Magic. This is a tempo spell boost Magic list made by 2017 Hearthstone World Champion Frozen. This deck is fairly similar to normal tempo spell Magic decks that we've talked about every single week. The general strategy is you have some extremely high tempo early game plays, oftentimes revolving around Assistant Alchemist, making something like a Shadow Scryer cheaper, or even something like an Ancient Text cheaper. You have tons and tons and tons of card draw through Demetrios' Spell, through Palace's Wand, through Voltmir, through All-Seeing Spire. All-Seeing Spire we talk about pretty much every single week. This card's super strong. It has horrible stats, 3 mana 0/2, so its stats are horrible, but it draws you a bonus card at the end of every single turn. It also lets you foresee. It has Order 10, so it's really hard to deal with. You have to destroy it with a spell or with God powers over multiple turns, and we've been talking about mid-range control war a lot. Mid-range control war controls the board primarily with blitz creatures, so they have a really hard time dealing with order stuff. And since they're a control deck, they're going to try to run you out of resources. All-Seeing Spire will be incredibly difficult for your war opponent to remove, and they'll draw you multiple resources every single turn, so it's very difficult for them to run you out of resources. So All-Seeing Spire is super, super strong. Let's see, what other card draw things do we have in here? We've got Miraculous Familiar, which isn't card draw on its own, but it's pseudo card draw in the sense that it generates you random spells, provided you played a spell this turn. So that's really great for generating you more value for when you're playing against those control board decks or those board wipe death decks. They're trying to run you out of resources. Getting more resources sort of stops their whole plan. Palace is, pretty much exactly the same. Generates you a random spell, or you get to delve a spell every single turn off Palace, so it's not exactly random, but similar to Miraculous Familiar, this creature is going to get you a ton of value, so it's super strong. Now we got the Scepter of Artistry. This is going to be, one of your win condition cards. You plop it down, give something like Palace extra spell boost, and now your Wormbreast, your Beams, your Forms of Power, and your Ancient Text are ready to deal a ton of damage. Even Vows of Learning, you have the deal 1 damage option, that can go face, and that's pretty strong with Spell Boost. And we've got a lot of Spell Boost in this deck. There's the Street Conjurers. He's always in these tempo Magic decks. Also got a copy of Frostbitten Channeler for even more spell boost. And that pairs well with, all those cards just mentioned. We got Beam in here. Beam does not see a ton of play, although it's a, a pretty powerful card in general. 4 mana is a reasonable mana cost. Deals 3 damage to your opponent's creature, as well as 3 damage to their face. That's also affected by spell boost, of course, so this is great for applying pressure to your opponent's life total, as well as controlling the board state. And then, last but not least, we have Monolith of the Storms, which is probably your main win condition. It's one of the reasons why all of that card draw is so important. Monolith of the Storm is the legendary, so you only have 1 copy in your deck, but it is capable of dishing out crazy amounts of damage, so it's really, really great to have. It's also a reason why there are so many of these incredibly cheap spells in the deck. It gets +2 attack for every spell you play, and then you get to deal his attack power as damage to whatever source you see fit. So Monolith of the Storms is really, really great at dealing like 12 to 15 damage the turn after you play him. This card is incredibly powerful. It's your main win condition. When you're playing against something like Board Wipe Death or Control War, you're going to want to play Monolith of the Storms after they Carnage Sweep or Apocalypse Now. Do all your chip damage with your creatures, wait for their board clear, plop down the Monolith, and that will be checkmate, ideally. And, for the most part, like we've been saying for the past couple of weeks, this is a super strong deck. It's really good at being proactive as well as reactive. If you're playing against an aggressive deck like Slayer War or like Aggressive Nature, you have your Star Shard Bolts, you have all your 1-mana spells for controlling the board. And if you're the aggressor, you're playing against those Control Wars, those Board Wipe Deaths, you can, spill out lots of creatures, deal tons of damage with spells. You're capable of dealing a ton of damage from hand with all of your, spell boosts as well as cheap spells to capitalize on that spell boost. It's a great deck. It's super fun to play. And I guess one thing that's important to note is you may have seen or may have noticed there are no tracking bolts in this deck. There's no tracking bolts, but there are 2 Illuminates. And Frozen made a great Reddit post explaining his thoughts about this deck in general, and Frozen's opinion. Tracking bolts like deal 1 damage AoE effect to everything is too detrimental to a deck like this, which has so many small creatures. You really don't want to be dealing 1 or more damage to your own stuff, according to Frozen, and it's definitely 1 or more considering how much spell boost you have in this deck. It's pretty high chance you have a spell boost creature floating on the board. And since you have so much spell boost, something like Illuminate will deal 3 or 4 damage the same way Tracking Bolt would, but it's more flexible at the 1 mana slot. It's also slightly stronger with something like Monolith of the Storms or Miraculous Familiar, considering it's half the cost of Tracking Bolt, so you can get those effects off of those 2 aforementioned cards easier with something like Illuminate. That being said, if you are uncomfortable not having Tracking Bolt, that's perfectly fine. Take out the Illuminates, put Tracking Bolts in. It's not going to change the win rate particularly, but all in all, this is a great deck, super fun archetype. If you like Magic, this is the list for you. So now let's move on to Nature, the most popular god in the meta currently. This mid-range aggressive Nature deck was made by Mighty Uncle. It is currently 21-0, 100% win rate, undefeated, and 42 games have been played worldwide with a 95.2% win rate overall. So this deck has an incredibly high win rate. The creator, Mighty Uncle, is undefeated. 21 other games been played by Not the Pilot, and it seems to have only lost 1 or 2 games, so this deck is incredibly powerful. It definitely wins. And this mid-range Nature deck leans more heavily into the wild direction than standard, and that is pretty obvious by the 2 copies of Wildfire. Wildfire is a 4-mana spell, deals 1 damage to each of your opponent's creatures, and gives +1/+1 and regen +1 to all of your wild creatures. So it is a super strong AoE buff card, as well as a fairly weak AoE removal card for your opponent, but it is super strong. Let's see, other cool wild cards of note. We've got Starving Sabretooth in here. This card doesn't see a ton of play, although it is an incredibly powerful card. It's a 4-mana 4/5, so the same stats as Wetland Ogre. So, its stat total is pretty much as good as you can ask for a 4-mana creature, and it has the very powerful effect of after this creature attacks a creature, if you are frenzied, give it regen +1. If you are a creature-centric, tempo deck, then you want to be making lots of value trades, and regen is really good for making value trades, so Starving Sabretooth is great. Let's see, besides that, it's fairly standard aggressive Nature stuff. You got your Marshwalkers, your wild hogs as well as your low-hanging fruits to buff up some of those early game creatures. You've got your Blackjacks, Canopy Barrages, Flame Blades for your early game, tempo as well as removal cards. Celestial Stag, super common in nature decks nowadays. It's just great. 3 mana, 3/3, decent stats. Blessed is great in the early game for controlling the Sanctum. Since you are a tempo themed deck, you want to be the one controlling the Sanctum. Oh, and on top of that, it generates you a random nature card every single turn, provided you play a creature, and most of your deck is creatures, so you will be playing a creature every single turn. So that's some great resource generation. Rabid Bear is super similar to Starving Sabretooth in the sense that his base stat total is really, really great for a 3 mana card. 3 mana, 3/4 is the same as Dune Cavalry or Hunt Warden, so it's pretty much the best you can ask for as far as stats are concerned for a 3 mana creature. And he has the added benefit of if you're frenzied, his roar effect gives him +1 strength, making him a 3 mana 4/4, which is even more powerful. We talked about the Wildfire. There are tons of wild creatures in this deck, all of them capable of being buffed by Wildfire, which is super strong. We've got the Brazen Moose. This is one of the most common cards in all of Gods Unchained. It's just a big body. 5 mana, 6/6 is good. Blessed is super strong. Confused is not the worst thing in the world. Falling Star, we talk about this card most weeks. It's just super good. There's never a bad time to play Falling Stars. If you have a board presence already established, it buffs your entire board so you can pressure your opponent's life total. If you've lost the board, it gets you 3 creatures as well as burns your opponent's biggest creature, which is very convenient. Black Jaguar, super high tempo relic, destroys one of your opponent's creatures while generating a creature, so that's super strong. Then you've got Pangolin. We talk about Pangolin every single week. He's got Blitz for immediate impact. He's got 2 armor, so he's hard to remove, and he's got 6 attack, so he can kill your opponent's creatures or them in general. Pangolin is arguably nature's best creature at the moment. It's incredibly powerful. And then the final nature card is Sudden Bloom. Mighty Uncle has said he prefers Sudden Bloom over the Hunt in this deck, which makes a lot of sense, considering this deck is extra creature-centric, and it makes extra powerful creatures, with that Wildfire, buffing everything's health, as well as giving them regen, so they're more likely to stick. And since your creatures are more likely to stick, Sudden Bloom becomes far superior to the Hunt. It's also effectively a 6 mana board clear, since, you're going to give a creature +5/+5, Twin Strike and Overkill. So that Twin Strike and Overkill will definitely facilitate clearing your opponent's entire board, and it'll leave you with an incredibly threatening creature for your opponent to deal with. In the neutral slot, we've got the Wild Hog, which is just a super strong 1 mana wild creature. And so this deck 21-0, super strong. It's got a great strategy. Play creatures, buff creatures, win game. If you like nature, which most people seem to, this is definitely a list that will perform well for you. Alright, so now let's move on to Deception. This is a mid-range control Deception deck. Like I said in the beginning of the video, Deception is in sort of a weird slot, or a weird spot in the meta right now, in the sense that there are a whole bunch of different Deception archetypes that you could choose to play from, but none of them are particularly good. There's no A or even B tier Deception deck floating around right now. So if you really love playing Deception, if it's your favorite god, then by all means play Deception. But if your goal is to do as well as you possibly can this weekend ranked, then Deception is probably not the god to go with. That being said, mid-range control Deception has been my favorite Deception archetype, as of recently. Generally, this deck's idea is to control the board, as the name would suggest. You've got lots of control cards like your Stone Skin Poison, your Sleep Dart, your Hunting Traps. Rapture Dance is great board control. Toasted Peace stalls. One thing that's an interesting takeaway from this is that Jack High board wipe death deck we talked about. Surprise Delivery sort of just single-handedly stops that deck. Not only do the barrels ruin the Kopesh, you can't guarantee infinite attackers monsters if there's a strong chance they get a stupid barrel instead of a Packers monster. It also ruins Triage Necromancer, so instead of bringing back Backstreet Bouncers or Sirens of the Grave, it'll probably be bringing back these stupid barrels. They'll just hurt them. So Surprise Delivery is a cool tech card against that specific board wipe death deck. Board wipe death, although incredibly powerful, is not particularly prevalent in the meta, so this isn't a genius tech card to put into your Deception deck. Just if you so happen to play against that deck, Surprise Delivery is surprisingly good against it. Yeah, but this deck's general win condition is it controls the board, and then it has tons of just value generators to outvalue your opponent. You've got Ludia's Descendant. This gets you a card from your opponent's deck every single turn when you use your God Power, which is Orpheo's Distraction. Orpheo's Distraction is a really great God Power for controlling your opponent's side of the board or for hiding your stuff, including this creature himself. So this guy generates you tons and tons of resources. Lightfoot Informant does a similar thing, just a decent creature that gets you some sort of spell from your opponent's deck for more resource generation. Toast-a-Piece is also a value card primarily. Toast-a-Piece can, stall your opponent if need be, but its primary goal is to make a bunch of really cheap creatures that you can play alongside That Which Aches for a whole bunch of Aching Disciples. The Aching Disciples are not only good for applying, minimal amounts of pressure, having a whole bunch of 3-attack creatures is relatively threatening. It also guarantees that you can't lose in fatigue, considering you're adding all of these guys that just keep going back into your deck when they die. Let's see. Oh, the Hollow. You can't. I was talking about value generation. Almost overlooked the Hollow. This generates you a guild creature pretty much every single turn by giving himself 2 order every turn, which is super strong. You've got your Demogorgons, which is your primary win condition against all the Slayer War decks and aggressive nature decks out there. You've got your Demonologist in order to draw your demos more consistently. And if you have drawn both of your demos by the time you get your Demonologist, it's no big deal. He will draw you your That Which Aches. I've also got Jason in here for some big value generation. And one fun thing to note is you can pair Jason with your Toast-a-Piece, so you can play 3 Jasons if you so choose. So, this deck is a lot of fun. It has really good board control, tools that we went over. But, the win condition is generating random cards, and many of those random cards are coming from your opponent's deck. But when your win condition revolves around generating random value, it's sometimes hard to win consistently. Like, that being said, this deck has a pretty good win rate, 73.9% win rate over 23 games, so it's definitely positive. But like I said in the beginning of this discussion, Deception is just simply not the best god out there. If you like Deception, if you like fun, wacky decks, this is a great deck for you. But if you are trying to get as many wins as possible this weekend, definitely do not go with Deception. Alright, so Zoolight is the last archetype to talk about for this week's video. Light is the least popular god in the meta currently, and that makes a lot of sense. Light is not particularly great in the meta right now. Light is definitely passable. Zoolight's strategy is simple yet effective. They spill out a bunch of creatures in the early game. You got your Card Sharks, your Driders, your Wild Hogs, your Skeleton Heavies. Pacifist is one of your big ones. You play all those creatures, you buff them up with Radiant Dawn. One of those creatures survives for a couple more turns. You buff it again with Canonize, and hopefully you overwhelm your opponent and win the game. That being said, a big issue for Light is there are little to no comeback mechanics for Light. So if you do lose the board, there's really no coming back from it, and you need to win the board. Because if you can't stick a good Radiant Dawn or Canonize, you simply can't win the game. So if you want to play a creature-oriented deck, Nature is really, really good. War is really, really good. And both of those gods have access to comeback mechanics. So if Light loses the board at any time period, even like on turn like 1, 2, or 3, they'll probably lose the game. So Light is a god that is particularly affected by the first versus second thing. Light's win rate probably drops between like 10 and 15% when they go second because of, like we said, there are no comeback mechanics, and it is absolutely imperative that Light wins the board. So if you like Light, you can totally play Light. It's a passable god. This deck here, made by Dragonstorm, has played 60 games and 81% win rate. That's a very positive win rate. But like I said, if you want to play a deck with a similar play style, War and Nature are just superior. So, yeah, if you like Light, play Light. But if you want to do the best you can possibly do, another god is definitely the move. Alright, so we've talked about the meta, we've gone over a bunch of archetypes. What is the conclusion? What is the absolute best archetype to play this weekend for the best possible results? And that answer is obvious. Mid-range Control War. It got 25 out of 25 last week. It got 25 out of 25 the week before. It'll probably go 25 out of 25 this week. This archetype is incredibly strong. It's been incredibly strong. It is good at being aggressive. It's good at being defensive. It can heal for a ton. It can generate lots and lots of value. This deck has it all. It is incredibly powerful. If you have the means to create a mid-range control war deck, you should definitely do it. It will get you tons and tons of wins. But whatever you go with, make sure you have fun. Tell us how you did in the TST Discord, and have a wonderful day. Hey, you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe to Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!